simply make a start. If we look at the topic list is just inside the first thing of the handout. Now, what we're on about here is the environment in which a typical business operates. And so the first thing we look at is the environment within the organisation. So if you imagine a fence drawn around the organisation, then the internal environment is everything that goes on in the organisation. And that's often called, they often talk about things like organisation cultures and how things are done. So we'll have a look at that. Then the second piece of the topic is looking at the external environment, and that's looking at stuff really, you could say it's the stuff outside the fence, what's going on in a business area or the world or New Zealand or something like that. Then we'll talk about one or two other things that are largely part of the external environment, and of course there's a lot of things, but a couple of them are listed there. People have to think about consumer legislation and other legislation, but particularly consumer legislation. And we acknowledge that the environment these days in which organisations operate is very competitive. Now, competitive in two ways. Companies that make things and provide services have got competitors all around the place. Organisations such as the sort of things we have over here, like the district council and the polytechnics and the health service and so on, in a way they are in competition, but a slightly different competition. They have major pressure from funding, which means that they are constantly having to look at how they can do things better or more effectively or with less money or something like that. So I'll run here a series of PowerPoints which sort of helps illustrate some of these things. Now, in Westport, have you got a PowerPoint on the other screen?
Yeah.
Right, that's the one with a woman in a pink shirt or something?
Yeah.
Yep, good, excellent. So, for these purposes, we talk about a business environment being those things in red: the social, technological, economic, and political environment in which a business functions. In this day and age, it's common to add some form of some form of term that talks about environmentally sustainable or something like that, because there's quite a lot of pressure, if you like, on this matter of environmental impacts. So the environment within a business and the environment that the business operates in, things that happen outside, affect, of course, decisions, strategies, processes, and performance. I just remind you that there's a printout of the PowerPoints on the back. So in marketing, we typically think about the micro environment in an organisation and the macro environment, that is the environment in which the organisation operates outside. So this here is looking at everything that, well, a number of things really that comprise the environment. So the internal environment is in the bottom half of the world, the southern hemisphere, and it talks about things like I'm not interpreting that correctly. It's in the purple bit, the internal environment. Sorry, I've forgotten how that hung together. So that's what's available or happening within the organisation, labour. And that involves things like the skill of labour and how productive the labour is. It includes talking about money, financial resources. It talks about materials, things they use to, especially if they're manufacturers, things they use to make something. And equipment, also in a mainly manufacturing or contracting environment. And this involves things like technology in terms of machines and that sort of thing. About half an hour ago I had the radio on and they were discussing robots and what robots might end up being used for. Pretty frightening, really. One of the things they reckon they were going to be used for was in aged persons rest homes type of things, and they reckon that they could use robots to bring around the doses of medicine each night. And when somebody was arguing about that, then obviously that wasn't very personal, but the person that was arguing for it said, yeah, but it's very accurate, the dosages will be right. Maybe. So you can imagine a little, what's that thing in Star Wars, R2-D2, you can imagine one of these things buzzing around a rest home handing out medicine. It'd be fairly interesting. And so that purple bit in that diagram is within the organisation, and the green bit is outside the organisation. And it involves potentially all of those things. So going around the clock, competition, economic environment, what's happened today that will have a small impact, not much, but a small impact. Official cash rates dropped 0.5%. We also, while we're on that, we probably in the developed nations are seeing some of the lowest interest rates we've seen for a long time. None of you are old enough, but I can remember not long after we took out a mortgage on a house, we were paying 19% interest on it. And inflation was 21%. A lot, isn't it? Anyhow, so in the outside world, technology comes into it, the political or legal environment, and as we will see, that's both within New Zealand and outside New Zealand. Political, legal environment, the Chinese have got a bit brassed off about something and they are all of a sudden finding fungus in our kiwi fruit. So you could call that political, because there's probably not much fungus in it. It's probably just a way they have of saying, you can't, we're not going to let you bring it in here for a little while. Then you've got demographic, the different peoples, the culture that the organisation operates in. So you could argue that there is a culture on the West Coast. You could argue there's a different culture between Greymouth and Hokitika, if you thought it was relevant. And finally, at 11 o'clock on that circle, there's the ecosystem. So this is this bit where these days we have to consider the ecosystem environment that we operate in. So there is a hierarchy of businesses, as you think of it, if you think about it. So we have our organisation. It typically operates within a region. So for us, you could probably say the West Coast is the reason. You could also say, well, I sort of said before, that there is a difference between Greymouth and Hokitika within the region. What do you think the differences are? Well, first of all, do you think there is a difference? There is. Do you think there's a difference in Awhika?
Not sure.
Between the culture of Hokitika and Greymouth?
Never thought about it.
So, what do you reckon, Aaron? Is there a difference between Hokitika and Greymouth?
There's a slight one, but I'll, say, and know enough people from there.
I think there is a difference, and we'll look at it in different ways, but one way of looking at it is the areas have a slightly different background. Like Hokitika was big into the gold mining, and so was the Grey Valley and everything. So that's a similarity. But then in Hokitika, flowing on from gold mining was really the farming and to some extent logging and everything. And reasonably significant early tourism. Most of the tourism on the coast came across the Alps and turned left at Kumara, not right at Kumara, and went on down to the glaciers and so on. The other thing about Hokitika is probably you could argue slight climate differences. In the Grey Valley, the heritage and that sort of culture that's developed is quite different. So once the gold mining had worked out of it, of course, came very strong in coal mining. And that brought about a significant development, if you like, of the Grey Valley culture in several ways. Firstly, it involved coming into New Zealand and the area a lot of people from outside. So there were Irish people, English people, Welsh people coming to work in the mines that had a mining background. Mines tend to work on a shift basis, so their sort of social life was a lot different. And there are quite a lot of contractors that tend to work for the mine, so they're all tied up with the mining thing. And the other thing that is different between the Grey Valley and Hokitika is that the mining industry, the coal mining industry in Greymouth, developed a very, very strong union culture, trade union culture. If you've done Kate's class, you probably might have learned that the first industrial strike in New Zealand was in Blackpool. And the foundation of the Labour Party in New Zealand came out of Blackpool. So, we can talk about a regional culture. Then we can talk about a national culture. So for our organisation, this will be New Zealand. And all the different parts of New Zealand that make up the laws, the people, the political system, the nature of the very big city of Auckland, and that sort of thing. Then outside of our country, for a long time, New Zealand has been active in international trade, originally with coal and farm produce, wool and meat, and then with things like the dairy product, big coming out of Hokitika. And so that builds a lot of international connections, or global connections, and at the same time we have an awful lot of stuff coming in. New Zealand imports a lot more than it exports. And so there are links all over the place for most organisations when they're looking at a global environment. Why is the line going around the global environment coloured red?
It's outside New Zealand.
Yeah, it's definitely outside New Zealand, but why is it coloured red? Because the global environment in terms of trade and economies and all of this sort of thing is increasingly being dominated by China. So that's why the line's red. It is also true that a tremendous amount of stuff coming into New Zealand and into our region is coming from other parts that aren't China, but an awful lot is. It's quite, most of you rush to the supermarket to get your shopping done because it's such a horrible experience, but it's quite illuminating to look just where stuff does come from that we're picking off the shelves. It's a bit frightening, really. And places like the UK, it's amazing they do actually produce a lot of their stuff, but they fly in and ship in stuff from the middle of Africa onto the shelves the next morning for fresh vegetables and all sorts of things. Right, so that's the hierarchy of environments, all of which we need to consider for our organisation. So, for most organisations, economic factors tend to dominate the operations. And so changes in the economy affect demand. In other words, the extent to which people will buy your product or your service, and the cost of things like materials and wages, the operating costs for the organisation. So here are a few changes that we can track if we want to, that send us signals about the state of the economy and how it might affect our businesses or organisations. So if you look at changes in that left-hand box, you first of all could think about, is there a growth in the economy? Is it reasonably buoyant and ticking along? Or is it not? And the measure for that, which we get, which is available in most newspapers and so on, approximately every month, is the gross domestic product, which is really a measure as if New Zealand was a thundering great business, and the gross domestic product is really our revenue from everything we are producing. You'll have to do the economics paper to find out the detail of that, but that's essentially what it is. So if you look in a newspaper, if you ever bother to want to follow something like this, a good economic growth, gross domestic product, would be around 3% a year, 3.5%. So every now and then it sneaks up towards 4 and they get quite excited, and every now and then it sneaks down to under 2 and they get less than excited, and sometimes it goes even worse. But if you think of around the world countries, with the exception of Germany, most of the countries in the EU are running very, very low percentages of gross domestic product growth. The US goes up and down like a yo-yo. At the moment it's probably around 3%. New Zealand is around 3%. And China, if you can believe their figures, is around 10%. Now that's fairly... It can be argued that high rates of gross domestic product are a bit risky, but anyhow, That's how it sits at the moment. It's also of interest to organisations and business organisations the question of inflation. The measure for that is the Consumer Price Index, and that is a measure of the changes in prices over a period. In New Zealand at the moment, and in fact many developed nations, the Consumer Price Index is low. It's about 1.5%. It wasn't that long ago that New Zealand struggled to get it in the 5 or 6% area. And you might have heard me say before that our first mortgage was taken out at 19% and inflation was 21%. So that's fairly horrendous. The third one there is employment, because employment obviously affects demand and to some extent organisations. So if there's a lot of people without jobs, that is if the unemployment rate is reasonably high, then of course there's less money available around to be spent on things like clothing, shoes, cars, all that sort of thing. So you can have unemployment, or you can sometimes have shortages. There's a little bit of publicity floating around the papers at the moment that some areas of the economy are short of employees. They can't get them. So dairy farm labour is probably an obvious one for this area. And over in Christchurch, the building and construction industry claim they're short. Unemployment rates. New Zealand's not bad, it's around 6-ish. When it goes down as low as 3%, you probably are in a situation where you're looking for people, because there seems to be a rate of unemployment around 3% that you can't really drop below, because you're talking about people who are changing jobs, or people who don't want to work, or people who can't work. So there's always an area of around 3% in an economy. The coast, of course, is taking a bit of a hiding at the moment on unemployment because of the layoffs, particularly the biggies are in Westport, where poor old things, you've had everything hit you at once. Low dairy prices, mines closing, and Holson moving out. It's a fairly grotty story, isn't it? And so there will be some unemployment there. In the Grey Valley, we've certainly got a reasonable amount of unemployment as well, mainly from mine closures and dairy prices. So there's some other things to dive into economics a little bit that indicate what's going on in our economic environment. The money supply. The money supply has a lot to do with the things they were talking about this morning, the official cash rate from the Reserve Bank. That affects the amount of money available in the system, which in the end affects interest rates. So the interest rates are the main thing there. Some people, particularly retailers like the warehouse and the supermarkets and some of the national chains, are watching credit card spending and data on household debt, because that gives an indication as to how much money might be being spent or might be able to be spent. And the third change that can happen is tax rates. They've been reasonably steady in New Zealand, except it wasn't that long ago that the GST went up. And of course, if the GST goes up, then we have a little bit less money to spend. I'll jump interest rates. They obviously affect availability of income after you've paid interest on things. Probably one of the biggest effects on New Zealand businesses, especially at the moment, but almost always, is the matter of the foreign exchange. You look at individual currency rates and you look at the trade weighted index. That is typically in the paper at least every week. And changes make a hang of a difference. For example, the rule of thumb, of course, is that if the exchange rate for a currency pair goes down, that's good for our exports and not so good for tourism or for buying things. So the sort of thing that happens is it affects, if you buy something from China or from Japan or from the United States, you'll be interested in currency movements from China for the yuan or the RMB, it's the same thing, from Japan for the yen, from the US dollar, and from the UK, the British pound. And they all vary and make the exchange rate, and so do ours, it makes the exchange rate change. For example, it wasn't that long ago that if we were to go to the UK or buy something in the UK, then we would need 3 of our dollars to get 1 of their pounds. And now we only need 2 of our dollars to get 1 of their pounds. So it is better for buying at the moment. And people that take holidays in Australia and all this sort of thing, they get to feel this a little bit, depending on how much they're going to get for the New Zealand dollar. So this is just to remind us the impact of foreign exchange rates. It impacts on exports of goods and services, how much we get in New Zealand dollars for something we sell overseas. It impacts on the imports of goods and services because that depends on how many of our dollars we need to pay for something we're buying overseas. And it affects tourism. Now, tourism is very like an export. If the exchange rate is down, then that tends to attract tourists because they get more for their money. If the exchange rate goes up, the tourists, it impacts on the tourists because they have to pay a bit more in New Zealand dollars for the things they may want. There are also some other things if we want to keep an eye on the external factors. Almost all banks have publications that come out that talk about the economy. They also talk about business confidence measures, so that if you're getting a report that says business confidence is up, you might be thinking, well, that's not too bad. You could be fairly happy about that. The share market is not a bad indicator. If the share market is rising, then that's indicating reasonably good economy. And then you can get retail sales statistics very easily, which gives you an idea of how and what people are buying. Some of which you could sort of see in the material that was attached to last week's handout. Now, 2007 was a long time ago, really, 8 or 9 years, say. But in 2007, there was a so-called global economic crisis. A lot of bubbles burst. And it impacted very heavily on banks all around the world, because the banks had been fueling a housing crisis, particularly, where they were so busy trying to push money out on mortgages and things like that, that they were lending to people that probably couldn't ever repay them. And in the end, the bubble burst. And big panic. So the question that hangs about the economy in New Zealand and other countries is, have we actually got over this? Because it became fairly obvious that that crisis hit in such a way that nobody really seemed to know what they could do about it. And the one slight worry that still sits around is that the banks basically, with the agreement of governments, used a thing they called quantitative easing. Now that is simply a fancy word to hide the reality that they were really printing money. They weren't physically printing it, they were computer entries, but it was the same thing as printing money. And they're still doing it, and there's quite a bit of wondering going on, how long can you go on doing this?
Sorry, Dan, what was that? Quantitative what, sorry?
Quantitative easing, E-A-S-I-N-G.
Thank you.
It's the banks and the governments trying to use a jargon to sort of hide what it really is. Quantitative easing is, I suppose, describing making money a bit easier to get, but the reality is it's printing money. And the crisis has had some quite long-tailed effects, like, I think I might have mentioned just before that the EU, with the exception of Germany, is the demand for all, within just about all of the 20-odd countries, is very low. They still haven't quite climbed out of it. And the outfits, you've probably read, they've sort of had a crisis in Greece where they've had to bail them out. Spain's a bit tenuous and Italy's a bit tenuous, and it's just a bit of unease around about whether they really got on top of this thing. So that's something to watch. And the impact of China. Whether we like it or not, the Chinese economy is probably now certainly the second largest in the world. It impacts almost everywhere. A cynic will say that the United States has an uneasy relationship with China because the United States is so heavily in debt that they borrow money at government level from China. So basically, China lends the US the money to buy Chinese products. And that's a fairly massive sort of movement. It also leads us to the conclusion that the Chinese call a fair few shots in that sort of area. We, of course, as a nation, the government is very keen on setting up trade relationships with that include China. The Trans-Pacific Partnership is the main one, and the New Zealand-China Free Trade Agreement is the other one. We're very keen to do what we can to gain from the demands from China. Sometimes we succeed, sometimes we don't. And so that's part of the some of the things that are important in the external environment. Now, at the end of this little PowerPoint set, I've dropped in some on consumer legislation, which is part of the legal environment we operate on with our organisations. Now, there is, of course, a horrendous amount of other legislation as well. Things like the Health and Safety in Employment Act, things like the Resource Management Act, and so on and so on and so on. But in terms of actually buying and selling, business organisations, of course, have to comply with consumer legislation. And there's some handout sheets right at the front of your handout number 2. And I'm just going to, you can read those because they're easy enough to read. I'll just summarise what the two things, the two important parts are. The first is the Consumers Guarantee Act. In a nutshell, the Consumers Guarantee Act is saying any product, like a lawnmower, for instance, or any service, like say an accountant, or a medical centre, or something like that, any product or any service that you sell must be fit for purpose. And usually you can put another word in front of it that says must be reasonably fit for purpose. I'll try and give you one or two examples. Supposing I went into, I don't know, Mitre 10 or something like that, and bought a lawnmower. And pretty pleased, it was reasonably cheap, it was $499. And I took it home, and after a while it started to pack up and run very roughly. I'd had it about 18 months or something like that. No matter what the guarantee said, that would not be reasonably fit for purpose. You could reasonably expect that a lawnmower would last longer than, say, 18 months. However, if I was a lawn mowing contractor and I went in and bought a $499 lawnmower and it packed up in 18 months, that would not be a reasonable situation. A domestic lawnmower you should expect to last for at least 18 months, probably longer. Used as a contractor, you are using it all the time and they're not built for that, those domestic mowers. So the sort of things businesses have to be careful about is they need to ask, in the case of lawnmowers, what are you going to use it for? And the person hopefully is honest and says, oh, well actually I'm going to use it because I'm going to do lawnmower contracting. Or they might not say that. But if that is the area of argument about reasonably fit for purpose, and if a lawyer or an accountant, you're going to ask for some advice about something, and they don't give it to you very well, or they're wrong, or something like that, then that is not fit for purpose. It isn't what you wanted. It isn't what you needed. It isn't what you're entitled to. So, that's why the Consumers Guarantee Act, people in business organisations need to be aware of it. It applies to goods and services, and you can read out the fine print in the handout. The Fair Trading Act is pretty much what the words say. You must trade fairly. I'll give you one or two examples. The main one is you should not use misleading advertising. So this means, to give you an example, if you are advertising bikes in the newspaper and you put in there mountain bikes from 199. Now, a person comes along to the shop and thinks to himself, oh, I suppose that is a mountain bike, it doesn't look very heavy or something like that. Or alternatively, comes to the shop and says, I'd quite like a 199 mountain bike, please. Can you show me one of those? Oh, no, we haven't got any more of those left. So they only had one. And that's bait advertising, things like that. Every now and then, at the moment, don't know whether you notice these things or not, but every now and then in the paper, you'll see somebody caught on this misleading advertising. So the Commerce Commission watches it pretty closely. There's also a few fine printy things, like you must, if you provide a sample to somebody and then subsequently sell them some of those things, it must be the same as sample. You can't provide them a good sample and then send them 100 ones that aren't so good. That's not fair trading, etc. Now, the other thing to watch is business organisations have to consider legislation for perhaps another country which could apply. So the most obvious ones are import regulations and standards. I'll try and give you a couple of examples. Import regulations vary from country to country. They can include tariffs, which is like a tax on something. Like if you try and send farm products into China, well, you probably can't, but even if you did, you'd probably get a tax on them. There are also so-called non-tariff regulations, which require that products have been tested or something like that. We generally refer to these as standards. So the New Zealand Standards Organisation has a whole heap of standards that apply to a whole heap of products and services, and so that's, if you like, a mark of reality for the product. It says that they're okay and they've been tested. The Aussie standards for all sorts of things, and we do tend to use Aussie standards in New Zealand a bit. And you'll see the argument that probably read in the paper that there's been some steel imported from China to use in motorway bridges in Auckland, and they got a bit worried about it because it had not been tested to a reasonable or the New Zealand standard for quality, and there was some doubt as to whether it was any good or not. So that's what that's all about. So, I'll move on shortly and talk a bit more about competition, which is the next topic. But while your brains are reasonably fresh, I'll refer you to that assessment I've given you. This assessment will cover your first handout last week's, this one on environmental factors, which we may not necessarily finish tonight, and then the last one is a little bit about evaluating information. So you are quite welcome to do these as you go along, and eventually I'll give you a handed date, which will be maybe 3 weeks from now, something like that. So you can either do them as you go along, or you can do what most people do and put them aside and think, oh, that can wait for a while, and then have a blast and do them all at once. That is entirely over to you. Just a few little things about these, particularly for those of you who haven't done this sort of assessment. I draw your attention to a few things. There's a mixture of questions. Some of them are asking you to identify a fact or a definition, or what does this mean, or some question like that. Some of you are asking you to make a comment on something or give an opinion about something. I'll just flick through at least the first page so that you get some idea of how these things hang together. So if you look at question 1A, a newly appointed CEO of a mining company was expounding his view that marketing was the most important function for any business. Now what you're being asked to do here is give 2 reasons that he might give to support his viewpoint. Not what you think about it. You need to read these questions really carefully. They're asking you to identify 2 reasons that he might give to support his viewpoint. Now, the next one does talk about an opinion. An accountant in a medium-sized trading company claimed that marketers couldn't see the wood for the trees, and that the essence of marketing was to promote the company's product range. Do you agree? So to get 3 marks for this, first of all, you'd have to say, do you agree or do you not agree? And then you would need to give a clear answer. That's another mark. With a reason or 2, that's the 3rd mark. So they hang together like that. Then 2B is a straightforward opinion from you. Suggest one trend in marketing, blah, 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 that may develop in the medium-term future. Which will give a clear reason for your suggestion. And probably your mind's going to drift towards electronic marketing and Facebooks and social medias and all that sort of thing. So over to you to make a call on which you think might be. Okay? And so they go along in that vein. Some of them are asking you for the factual stuff, some of them are asking for an opinion. So you can take those with you. Now the last thing I'll do tonight is I will do the little competition bit, and then next week we will discuss so-called corporate social responsibility, which is something that modern business environments have to consider. So I'll run a few competition slides so you can see what this means. Now, to some extent, these PowerPoint slides are talking about business and organisations trying to face up to competition and achieve a competitive advantage. Some advantage that your organisation can achieve that gives you some benefits over and above what your competition might have. And to reinforce this, just using this term hyper-competition, which means that competition is very strong, it is everywhere, and something we all have to contend with, particularly since we've had the impact of globalisation, global market and global sources. Just to get your head around this a moment, like, supposing you have been operating a bookstore quite happily, people were coming in and buying your books and magazines, all of this sort of thing, and Amazon comes along, and that is hyper competition. I mean, Amazon is competing in the book trade with in just about every country now. It's huge. They're not only doing books either, they're doing DVDs, products, and so on and so on. So that's a form of hyper competition that we're having to face up to somehow or another. A little bit closer to home, we might be in a situation like we've got a coffee bar. And somehow or another we've got to achieve a competitive advantage in the coffee bar. And it's not that easy. I mean, everybody expects a coffee to taste good and have a pricing expectation for it. It's quite a challenge. So, put simply, we're going to get a competitive advantage, possibly, if we can offer customers greater value. Now, greater value could be by lower prices, or it could be by providing greater benefits. One of the problems with trying to get lower prices is that your competition will always follow you, so that if you say, now you can come to my coffee bar and you can get a long black for $2.50. But as soon as you do that, the competition's going to basically come down to the $2.50. Greater benefits, you might have to think of something else. And this is now, you've seen some of the things that people try to use as benefits, don't you, in coffee bars, like Wi-Fi, free Wi-Fi, and all of these things. And so on. So we typically tend to want to focus on so-called differentiation advantages. Because cost advantage is okay, but it may increase your profit a bit, but it doesn't necessarily always increase sales or encourage people to come to you. So differentiation advantage is trying to get an answer to the questions, why should I use you and not somebody else? And so when we look at this, we say that a firm can gain an advantage if it can produce or has resources and capabilities that are better than somebody else's. I'll just flip these a bit because this is a wee bit outside the scope of some of the course. So we talk about a distinctive competence as a competitively valuable capability that a company performs better than its rivals. Something it does better than its rivals. There's a lot of circumstances which we can think about in business organisations. Now I'm going to jump these a little bit to get to the main point for this area of competitive advantage. You have to have something that can't easily be copied. And it is becoming increasingly important that we look at people. We can say that technologies, products and services can be copied by competitors. I used to buy a bit of stuff to make bikes with, and I recall one day that some of you probably won't know anything about brands of bike stuff, but I'd got some new style of brakes from Shimano in Japan, and they were pretty slick brakes to put on bikes. And my next stop was Taiwan, and these went to a manufacturer that made brakes, amongst other things. And one of these Shimano brakes fell out of my bag, and the guy that I was in the room with said, "Hey, can I have a look at that?" And he looked at it very intently and blah-de-blah. And basically, by the next morning, they'd copied it. So even pretty serious technology can be copied. But the argument goes that if an organisation can achieve highly committed, motivated people who care, you can't copy that advantage. Very hard to copy it. It's also very hard to achieve in a business. So, what about the people? They have your knowledge and skill base that can make your firm competitive. Some of you will be aware of the tendency to use more and more casual employment agreements, so that somebody comes and works part-time or for a fixed term. They bring somebody in for some reason, so we'll give you a contract for full-time, but it'll only be for 3 months, things like this. So you end up with a whole lot of this sort of situation. If you go too far with that, then the people will come in, they will do a job, but they're not particularly committed to your firm and whatnot. They're just working for the position and the money. Whereas if you have some people who you can build up over time, to build up your firm's knowledge and skills and feel more committed to the company, the chances are you will have a competitive advantage. However, particularly in New Zealand, but in quite a few other countries, we seem to take a very short-term view of this sort of thing, and in the end, we tend to try and drive the labour price down so low by all these other methods that we actually miss out on this business of building a people culture. Some firms try work quite hard at it, and use training schemes and various other ways of winding people up to build knowledge, build skills, and become committed. It's very well worth doing, but you don't get the benefit for a while, and that's where people balk. They don't prepare to make a long-term commitment to it. Sustainable competitive advantage is all about getting a competitive advantage that will last for a while. So it would need to be difficult to mimic. It would need to be unique. Whatever it was would need to last. And it would absolutely need to be better to the competition and applicable to different situations. So these are just a few examples of things that could help that process. The only true sustainable competitive advantage is to build an organisation that is so alert and so agile that it will always be able to find an advantage no matter what changes occur. It's a very dramatic way of putting it. It's probably pretty true. Now, I won't necessarily go around the block completely with this, but this happened to be part of an exercise that was given to Chinese university students in 1990s. And they had to choose some ways in which they could choose a particular product or service or something like that and they had to suggest competitive advantage, how they could get it. So some of them chose hoodies. These are different sorts of hoodies. That is actually a hoodie, even though you can't see it. Right? The computer. How do you get a competitive advantage with a computer? Somebody said you have a left-handed mouse. Well, they did things like colour and this sort of thing. Shoes. Bicycles, glasses, so these are all some of the things. Now, one group of young university women got onto the shoes thing. I found it difficult not to sort of laugh a bit at this, but it was semi-serious. They got onto the shoes. And the four of them came up and very seriously told us how they were going to make the shoes competitive advantage. Very seriously. There was no humour or anything like this thing. Anyhow, this is what they came up with. Yes you can. You can just see what they came up with. Sorry, the slide's not very good. They decided that the competitive advantage for the issue was you could just adjust the heel height. You can see that black line down there. That they had a little turn screw somewhere or another, I forget where it was. They actually made a model of this thing. And the heel slid up that line like that. If you wanted to lower the back of the shoe and have a low heel shoe, if you wanted a high heel shoe, the heel slid down here, came down to about here somewhere, and had a high heel shoe. And they were terribly serious about this. A little bit hard not to be amused by it, but I kept a straight face. But that was their effort. Okay, that's got us about there. Next week, if you could bring that handout again, please, and we will start to trot down the social responsibility. Any queries?
No.
No. Marcel, if you wouldn't just mind leaving those there, because I could probably, I'll flick Ashley an email and she can just come and pick them up.
Okay.
Right?
Yep.
Okay, Ethan?
Cool, thank you.
Well on you, thanks for coming in.
See ya.
Thanks, Sam.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye.
Can I ask some dumb questions now?
You can ask some dumb questions, what you
Everything
can.
else is gone.
So, for this assessment,
Yes.
is this to be handwritten or
No.
typed?
No.